Okay, well, I'm sure if someone is, they'll be able to catch up to us. So what we did in that first 50 minutes was go through like the concept of income inequality and show just how fuzzy everything is and how it, like, if we're to interpret it, we need to put our values into it. Okay. To interpret it, we need to put our values in, but we constantly see people interpreting it for us. And they'll put out the number, something to do with income inequality, and they'll say this is a disaster or this isn't a problem. It's been rising heavily through time, it's been falling through time, and they'll talk about a whole lot of jazz. Okay. Now, in order to make sure we can actually have a discussion about things ourselves and sort of understand what's going on, we need to know how it gets measured and how those measures refer to different values we might hold. So the core part of what we're going to do from here is talk about that measurement. And then once we've got that, we're going to talk about policy. And again, the different types of values that might come into how we think about policy and redistribution. So let's kick it off. How do we measure it? So we've introduced the Lorenz curve, which was really the core of how we think about measurement. So over here we have proportion of dollars. Down here, proportion of people. Lorenz curve doing its thing. 1, 1. And a line where you have completely equally distributed income doing that. Okay. So from there, we can get a lot of what we're going to actually talk about all set up. But where is this coming from again? It's coming from individual level data. So we have some sort of household economic survey, say. And then we have a whole series of individuals. Now think how we build this thing up, taking people with the lowest income. What happens if we put children in here? Okay, there's going to be a whole lot of zeros. What happens when we put in a household where there's one income earner, another person who's not working, but still part of that household? They'll come in as a zero as well. What happens when we have a farmer and they go off and they don't report any income, but they manage to do what we would view as income by expensing their own business? They'll turn up as a zero as well. Okay? So we have all these issues where people are turning up as zeros, even though we know that they're experiencing consumption in some way. And really it's that consumption that we're wanting to talk about. Those opportunities to actually live your life, okay? Not some accounting measure of what they have in income as an individual right now. So for that, we need to go and ask ourselves, what is income? And what is our unit of analysis? So when we go and build this, I've specifically been talking about using individuals so we would get that weird stuff where there's children. Right. But when we're thinking about income itself, we know that we're interested in what a person can consume. Okay? A dollar wouldn't have much use to me if no one accepted that dollar. If you paid me in a dollar and there was no use for it in terms of buying consumption, then there would be no use value associated at all. So when we think about income, we can go through a whole series of different things that all relate to different concepts. So one thing you may have heard quite often is active versus passive income or earned versus unearned income. This has a really old history and it's a completely non-useful distinction. Okay. Earned and unearned income is coming from the idea of income is earned by us going out and working and sacrificing our labor time, while unearned income is just some passive income that comes from us having some capital, having an amount of savings, having a factory, having a machine, and that generating us income. But to go and actually build up that capital, you had to sacrifice consumption earlier. So in the same way that you've earned income in an earned income sense by sacrificing time, you earn capital income by sacrificing consumption. So both of them involve a sacrifice, and both of them are forms of income. If we go a little step further, you might hear people talk about the ideas of windfall income, and you might hear people talk about capital gains there as well. So when you have a windfall, that's where you just get a chunk of money, okay, a chunk of income, a chunk of ability to consume from not doing anything. Now, the issue with using the term unearned is often people confuse unearned income with windfall income when the two are quite distinct. Both earned and unearned income involve a behavior where someone generates income. And so economists will often call them factor incomes, and they will talk about labor income and capital income, the income you generate from your factor of production. Now, when we go and look at money income, we're talking about those sorts of things we actually observe in terms of money. So we receive a paycheck from our boss, that's our money income. But there can be these windfalls, these capital gains that occur in the background. So if you have a house and that house appreciates in value, that wouldn't be part of your money income. But the fact that the house has appreciated in value would mean if you sold that house, you could turn around and you could buy some things with that, some consumption. Now, we've got to be really careful with that concept. People completely misuse it to make it sound like people that own houses have become much and much wealthier. Because remember, if you sell a house, you still need the services a house gave you. So you need to ask what's happened with rent. What has happened in terms of you buying a same or similar house? If all house prices go up, it's quite different than if just your house price goes up. Okay. So you want to keep those sorts of concepts together. Now, Haig-Simon's income is the very other extreme, where you count all of that type of income, and you count anything, all sorts of paper gains. So imagine you're Jeff Bezos, and the share price in Amazon shoots up, and you make a whole lot of money. Well, the thing is, if you went to sell that to get consumption now, you would make the share price tank, and you wouldn't be able to get as much money as those shares are worth on paper. So your ability to sell those shares in order to generate the income, to generate the consumption, is lower than their paper price. So Haig-Simon's income takes a measure of the value of wealth now compared to a value of wealth in the future based on market pricing. It assumes you could sell all those assets and it wouldn't lead to a fire sale. And that determines what your income is. So you take money income and you take an increase in the value of your wealth. Now, Haig-Simon's income is a great way to think about income because it's saying the following. Imagine you go to spend right now and you don't want to change your wealth position at all. You do not want to change your wealth position at all because you might have future consumption you want to do. In that case, what could you spend now? That's all it's asking. And that is the pure economist definition of income. Now, accountants think we're all morons. Like, I've been to heaps of meetings where accountants tell me that. I work at IRD, so I hear it all the time. And they think we're morons because of that paper gain point, okay? They say that a big business owner couldn't sell all their shares without tanking the price of the company, okay? So that's a practical thing to keep in mind with how we calculate these things. But if you just used money income and you pretended that there was no value being accrued in assets and there was no capital gains, you would be understating measures of inequality that depend a lot on those capital gains. Anyway, those are definitions. What do we need to know? Income that we're interested in is about someone's consumption opportunities. Now, when we're thinking about consumption, we've talked in a very nominal sense. I keep using this dollar symbol. But we know that the price of the different goods and services themselves can change. What $100 means now is quite different to what $100 meant 50 years ago. As a result, when we go and compare things, we want to keep in mind the fact that prices change. It's not just the overall price level, okay? We're doing distributional stuff here. We're allowing lots of different things to change. There's what's called heterogeneity. So someone on the benefit buys very different goods and services to someone who lives on Oriental Parade owning their own property, okay? And they both buy very different goods and services to the sort of average person. Because of that, what happens with prices and what they experience can be very different. So when we go and compare their incomes, we want to make sure we've taken into account how prices for different groups has changed as well. Then when we talk about inequality, we need to actually note what the hell we're talking about. So are we talking about market incomes? When we looked at the idea of having labor income and capital income, that's generated in the market. There are market prices, and that leads to a certain amount being paid to a worker, a certain amount going to a capital owner, yada, yada. Now, we know that's not the income you actually have to spend and consume. We could take out tax, okay? I can't spend my tax dollars. They get taken away from me. But I could also include transfers, right? If I'm in a situation where I'm on a low income, I can receive job seeker support while I work. If I'm on a moderate income, I could receive working for families. And that is income I can use for consumption, even though it's not coming from my employer or my ownership of assets. Finally, I can also turn around and use the healthcare service. I can use the road. Those also give me value and I can consume them. So where there are non-market products, we can count them. Furthermore, what about our friend before, where we had a household where one person was at work, earning a market income, and the other person was not, but they were doing things at home? Okay. If instead that person did go to work and hired someone in to do that, we would count that as a market income, a market transaction, but we're not, because there isn't a direct price being traded, being paid. We would want to include that as well when we think about the income available to that group. So each time we go through these things, there are all these distinct elements that come in, and we need to be very clear about the type of income inequality we're talking about. If we have massive market income inequality, but then everyone has the same amount to spend, are we in a situation where we would feel like that is very bad? If you look at countries like the Scandinavian countries, they have the most unequal wealth distribution in the world, okay? They have much, much more wealth inequality than we do. But they have much lower inequality in post-tax and transfer income than a lot of other countries. And it's because of specific choices they've made. Now, where are we? Cool. So, we also want to think about our friend, the family. So we've talked about a bunch of individuals here, but $100,000 for one individual compared to $100,000 for this family sitting here with all these kids is not the same thing, okay? When there's so many people involved, that $100,000 is being split across a lot of people. Now, how many people are there? I only just popped this picture up, so I didn't actually count. 3, 6. Okay. So then could I say that an individual earning 100 divided by 6,000, whatever that is, 18,000 or something, okay? Could I turn around and say that an individual earning 18,000 is the same as this family of 6 getting $100,000? No. Could I say that this family getting $600,000 is the same as an individual getting $100,000? No. Okay. Because there's actually 2 types of differences going on here. When we have a family makeup, it's not just the number of members we're thinking about when trying to determine the need, it's also their age. Why does working for families do different payments for children of different ages? Because there's a perception that the needs related to the child change through the child's age. Furthermore, in this case, it looks like we only have a single parent household as opposed to a household with 2 parents, which will also then have different needs. And then when we compare adults and children and second members of the household, and also possibly non-family members of the household, people that are renting there, other family members that aren't part of the family in an economic sense, well, they can all share resources with each other as well. So if I'm sitting here in this house and we buy gigantic loaves of bread, I know that we'll eat them, okay? I know a gigantic loaf of bread is disproportionately cheaper than buying lots of little loaves of bread, okay? I know that we're sharing on rent. I know that we're sharing on power. As a result, the cost of me meeting those needs is lower because the household is larger. Now, we capture these concepts by doing this thing called an equivalence scale. So if there was no sharing in the household at all, we all lived like individual automatons, then we could do that thing before we would just divide by the number of people. But instead, we lower that number a bit with an equivalence scale to take into account the fact that people share. Now, how do you work this out? You go to your household economic survey, where there's a whole lot of individual level data. You look at households, you work out what they've got, you compare it to when people say they're struggling or not struggling, and you try to estimate what that equivalence scale should be. We don't have to do that here. We just have to know this exists. So these things, all this stuff here, is included in the income inequality measures you see in the paper. Okay? Equivalence scales are there. They will talk about equivalized individuals in a household. And they're just talking about taking the household income and dividing it by the equivalent scale. So not the number of people, but a smaller number that takes into account that they're sharing. And that's what they're doing. They're pretending that's fine. That's how you then get rid of need, and you can make all these households comparable. Okay, a household with one person, a household of 6 people is comparable in the measures we're building because we've gone and done that. And then they pop them all there. End of story. But one thing we notice here is differences in need are missing. Okay? So you go and look at this curve, and you'll see that amongst beneficiaries, there's huge differences in the amount the government pays. Okay? And you get people like the Taxpayers Union saying, wasting money, blah, blah, blah. And the UK was especially bad for this. In the UK, they had this huge thing where they showed that amongst retired people, it was higher income retired people that were receiving more government transfers. Okay? Now, do you know why higher income retired people were receiving higher transfers? Can anyone hazard a guess? No, not quite. So I'll give a hint. So they were higher income in terms of what they were earning on the market. So they were still working. So why were retired people that were still working in the UK getting more in government transfers? It's a tricky question, so if you've got no idea, it's all good. But okay, so what was happening is you had people with really bad health conditions, and they had to stay in the labour market in order to get sufficient income to get treatment. The UK system was quite stingy and also only gave some support if you were still in the labour market. And therefore, it was people that were very ill staying in the labour market that were receiving the transfers. So you had the papers over there say high income, and they weren't particularly high income, but high income retired people get transfers, blah, this is so unfair. It's because they hadn't thought about why. They hadn't actually asked, is there differences in need? Is there a reason causing this? And when you hear that, the policy failure is that they're so harsh on those people, not that they're being too light. Okay? No. Cool. So here we have this idea of income and unit of analysis. So we've said income can be a bit fancy, and we're talking about this equivalized unit, and things like differences in need can really throw out what we do. And you make different assumptions on these, you get very different stories about what inequality looks like and how inequality has changed. Now, when you see a newspaper article, they're not going to draw you a Lorenz curve, okay? They're not going to turn around and start pointing out parts of the distribution and how people have different characteristics or are suffering from different needs. They're usually going to say Gini coefficient does what, okay? And so we want to think about these different measures of inequality and what they represent. So where's our friend again? We had these people, right? I pretend these are proper income units, so we don't need to think about them. How are we going to talk about inequality here? So, does this course have any stats in it? No, that's cool, that's cool. We won't be doing too much here, so don't worry. We might naturally say that there is variance in our distribution of incomes. Okay, so a really natural thing to start with is, can we just do inequality with variance? Now, we have differences here. Okay, we can see, okay, the average is $2. So the variance is the absolute difference between each of these and the average. So I've got negative $1 squared plus 0 squared plus 1 squared. Okay, and then that is all divided by the number of people. So here we got 2 over 3. Beautiful. So there's our variance. And then we'll say, oh, okay, well, this is all squared to make it absolute. It's more the standard deviation we want to think about, which is just the square root of this. So the standard deviation equals the square root of 2 over 3. Right? And this could be our inequality measure. What are we doing with this? Well, we've got the mean of incomes, the average income, and then over all these individuals, we're coming up with a summary measure of the difference between them, okay, of how they're spread. Now, this isn't actually a measure we use because it acts a little bit funny if we go and double everyone's income, okay? But the way it acts funny is something I really want to show to you because it helps us realize what an inequality measure is measuring and how that might be different to what we think is an issue with inequality, right? Okay, so you've got this going on. What happens if we double everyone's income? Well, goes up $2, $4, $6. Nice. The average is $4. So our variance is now the difference between each one and the average. So we've got this. Which equals 8/3. And so our standard deviation. Okay, so what we can see there is the variance has increased 4 times over when average income has doubled. Okay, and the standard deviation, if you go and plug it in, has doubled. Okay, so the standard deviation as a measure increases with the scale of the economy. Why does this matter? We have economic growth through time, right? So when we look at what's happening in the economy, if we had economic growth that was proportionally shared amongst everyone, okay, so everyone's income's doubled, we might think that's cool. And the standard deviation would then say inequality has doubled, which might not be what we mean. Now, there is some truth to what it's saying. The gaps between the incomes have gotten larger, but they've gotten larger in proportion with what's happened to their income. So, if the growth of the economy was just prices going up, right, this wouldn't feel right at all. We would be like, oh, we're increasing prices and we're saying it's more unequal, when actually the amount people can consume is exactly the same. But if it is actually buying power that has gone up, we might have values that say we're interested in this type of measure. So I don't want us to rule it out 100%, but this is not what any income inequality measure actually does. Now, what we've got up on the board is this other measure called the coefficient of variation. What's the coefficient of variation? It's this divided by the mean. That's a standard deviation divided by the mean. Now, you can see the mean has gone from 2 to 4 because the standard deviation doubled and the average doubled. Coefficient of variation won't change at all. Same number. Okay? Coefficient of variation does not change with the scale of the economy. All it measures is the relative position of people. The fact that this person has half the income of that person and a third of that person. It still measures that relative position, but it says nothing about the absolute differences. Now that's really key. That's an explicit assumption about income inequality measures, and all of the ones you see capture that. All right, now, we've got a bunch of different measures here. These are the ones you're likely to hear about in public. So we've got quintile ratios, and they also include your things like top 1% shares and everything. What we're doing with a measure like this is we're saying take someone at a certain position, take someone else at another position, what's the ratio of their income? That is similarly going to be scale invariant like this. Okay. Now, what's the point of that? We might look at top 1% shares through time and say the top 1% of income earners seem to get much higher income or much lower income, and we feel a certain way about that. A common quintile ratio that we'll look at is the 80-20 ratio. Okay. The Gini coefficient is actually our friend here in number form. Okay. So the Gini coefficient is not equal to this area, but it's related to it. If this area gets bigger, the Gini coefficient goes up. If this area gets smaller, the Gini coefficient goes down. Okay? So our Gini coefficient is our numerical representation of the difference between the line of complete equality and the Lorenz curve. So you hear someone talk about that Gini, blah, 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 blah. They're just talking about that little red area. Okay? The Atkinson inequality measure is another measure you might hear about, and it works the opposite way round. So an increase in the measure is actually a reduction in inequality, and it relates to all these concepts of related to Okun's leaky bucket, okay, in terms of the trade-off between our concern for inequality and the potential sacrifice of income that would come alongside it, okay? And it's a useful measure, but you're not going to see it quite as often, and we're not going to focus on it here. Okay, the reason I pop it there is because of the motivation for why people built the Atkinson measure. Well, Atkinson did, and some other guy I've forgotten the name of, a Russian guy. Golly, you'll probably know. The thing that's happening here is we can see that this inequality measure is taking the differences between these two lines. So it's weighting differences in income, relative differences in income, between these people based on these curves. The Atkinson measure allows us to weight different parts of the distribution more. If we're worried about someone on a low income having a low income more than we're worried about someone on a middle income having a low income relative to high income earners, then the Atkinson measure can allow us to figure that out, okay? So within that, there's going to be different values that we hold. Similarly, the quintile ratios can tell us about that concept, but they're really vulnerable to the idea of you not having a change in those two groups, but you're having a change everywhere else, okay? So imagine that we've got our person here at the 20th percentile. We've got a person over here at the 80th percentile, okay? Our 80-20 ratio is the ratio of their two incomes, okay? Which is represented by the steepness of these two curves. Now imagine you have a situation here where this curve has actually, this will do. This curve's actually gone up here, okay? And then it's the same steepness here, so the same income. And then it's doing its thing over here, and it gets the same steepness here, and then it does a funky thing over here and goes back up to that. Okay. So these two incomes are still the same, right? These are still the same incomes, and we end up with the same cumulative share, but this entire curve is closer to the line of complete equality than the prior curve. So the Gini coefficient's lower. So if we've done something that's reduced income inequality, it might reduce the Gini coefficient but not change the 80-20 ratio. Now, this is a bunch of blah without examples. Why am I going on about this? Okay, so take your 90-10 ratio. You'll see people quote this in New Zealand all the time. Guess who's in the bottom 10%? Okay? Who do you think will be in the bottom 10% in New Zealand? Beneficiaries, children. These are all reasonable assumptions.
Are we talking about like cultures, like potentially?
Not necessarily, but, you know, I'm thinking children and beneficiaries is probably the best way to start it. So, remember we've gone and taken a measure that tries to like take children and give them their income of their family with that equivalent scale. So if we didn't do that, it definitely would be children. So we've taken that up. With beneficiaries, it's really common to think that, but their income's higher than that, okay? The bottom 10% doesn't include any beneficiaries, okay? The bottom 30% doesn't include any retired people who are receiving national super, okay? If you've had someone move from overseas and they're not eligible yet, they might be there, but it doesn't include any person eligible for national super, okay? The bottom 10% is largely people like farmers, students, okay? People who are reporting a different income or people who are just, you know, students and so are expected to earn income in the future and don't receive the same type of support. In that way, if you see the 90-10 ratio, that 10% number doesn't make much sense. Instead, 80-20 ratios make more sense because that's where the beneficiaries come in. That's often the floor on income, assuming that there isn't something making it difficult for a beneficiary to receive income, which does happen as well, okay? So the 80-20 measure is often the sort of thing we'll look at because it captures the group that we see are receiving the income floor and who are vulnerable in certain ways. Now, when we look at the Gini coefficient overall, if we see an increase in this group that we think is mainly farmers and the such, we might not want to value that much at all. And in that case, we would turn around and we would build an Atkinson measure that rates these different groups differently, okay? Based on what we think. But you can see when we start doing that, when we take quite imperfect data and we start saying we should treat different groups differently, that starts to sound like discrimination, okay? So every time we make a choice and every time we build a measure, we need to be conscious of those things. Conscious of, are we building in types of discrimination? Why is this group being treated this way? It all needs to be explained. An article by a journalist saying the Gini coefficient I saw on the stats website is blah is not doing that. Now let's look at some New Zealand measures. Okay, so this is, it's got the website there, doesn't it? Where are you? Chartbook, yeah. Cool. So there's this, it's not that old a book, I guess. and it's got all the different income inequality measures based on tax data for all sorts of different countries. Okay, and this is just their one of New Zealand. And they put all sorts of like random little indicators in here. You'll see there's not much about wealth because New Zealand doesn't actually have much in the way of wealth data. But you have over here the individual level Gini, which is just based on taxable income for all taxpayers, and this equivalized one over here. So the act of equivalization that we talked about earlier does lower measures of inequality quite a bit. The big increase in inequality everyone talks about here looks quite small compared to these other measures, but that's because the scale is throwy. So what was happening back here, this is 1987, you had things that genuinely increased inequalities, such as product market regulation changes, but you also had things where people reported income differently. So when fringe benefit taxation was introduced, a whole lot of business owners that previously had paid themselves untaxed fringe benefits suddenly saw that fringe benefits were very highly taxed and started reporting income instead. So when you're using the tax data, you can see a big increase in reported income there because we changed what was a pretty massive loophole. Okay, same thing happened in the US at the same time. So although there does clearly seem to be an increase in inequality in that period, it is a little bit exaggerated. Now, if you want to talk more about the history of New Zealand's income inequality, that's something we can do, but it's not something I'm going to cover right here. Okay, so that's probably best to email me about. Cool. Now, another thing that's important to point out at this stage is time. So everything we talked about here was quite static. The income definition was don't let wealth change. But, you know, we do want levels of wealth to be different over our life cycle because we're accumulating wealth for a reason. Okay, so there should be a picture there. Yeah, there's a person having their life cycle. At different stages of your life cycle, you will want to save or dissave on the basis of your expected earnings and your expected earnings in the future. So it's not that we care about people's income right now per se, but I don't like to rule that out. It could be that current income might tell us something about lifetime income, or it could be that people are unable to access their savings, like during a big recession where asset prices collapsed, or they're unable to borrow because banks say, I'm not sure if I can trust that you're actually going to get future earnings. And because they're what's called liquidity constraints, current income can be important as well. But lifetime income is often the thing we most think about when we think about inequality. Now, a lot of these measures of inequality we have fall very sharply if we look over someone's life cycle, okay? Because when you are in your prime earning years, whatever they are, you're going to be saving money for your retirement and paying back debt you took on when you were young. When you're young, you're going to borrow to go and get education or build up assets. And when you're old, you'll be dissaving. Then that's because you've built up this wealth in order to consume in the future. The income you earn follows a different profile than the actual times you want to spend it. Okay? And for that reason, you will build up wealth through time, and you want to run it down or increase it. Now, people are perfectly allowed to do that. And the fact that they do that means their position shifts over time. Okay? When I was 18, I would have been in that bottom 10% because I was a student. Okay? By the time I was 19, I had 2 jobs while studying, and therefore I might have been able to push myself up into the bottom 20%. Okay? Wellington's always been an expensive place to study. Now I would be somewhere further up because I'm in my prime earning years. Now, when we think about people shifting through time, any measure we take on that redistributes from current low-income earners to from current high-income earners to current low-income earners can be seen in 2 ways. It can be seen as redistribution or as insurance. If you take $1 off me now and give it to me when I'm young or give it to me when I'm older, that will be a situation where we're redistributing over my life cycle. If you turn around and you take $1 off me and that's provided to someone on a lower income, that's redistribution. Okay? So redistribution and insurance are conceptually 2 quite different things. And when you go and you look at different welfare systems through the world, the Danish system does more for insurance than it does for redistribution, okay? The vast majority of what Denmark does is redistribute over a person's life. And that's quite different from the other Scandinavian countries, which aren't like that. When you look at New Zealand and Australia, we're very, very, very redistribution focused. Okay? And when we get more into that, I'm going to describe some of the differences there as well. But the incentive for having that difference can be quite different. Yeah. Now, the final thing here, when you hear people talk about income mobility, they're talking about the idea of someone's ability to move to be high income earners and then move down to be a low income earner when they're older or when they decide to be. Okay? It's the ability to move between types of incomes earned through your life cycle. And this reflects back to the idea of opportunity. Okay, so do people have the opportunity to make these choices, to build up wealth, etc., etc.? Now, when we talk through life cycles, all that stuff I said, that sounds way more like what politicians and journalists talk about when they're thinking about inequality, right? All that stuff about, over someone's life cycle, they should have the chance to blah, blah, blah. Our static measures don't tell us that much about this. They're actually really misrepresentative about talking about a life cycle, okay? So we need to be really careful using those measures to make calls about this. If you go and you take out the effect of age, where people are in their life cycle, from these measures, you end up with inequality that's about 1/3 of what you get from static measures, okay? If you turn around and you look at what's happening here, okay, and you look at the fact that the population distribution has gotten older through time, you know that you have people that invested in different skills when they were young and their incomes were relatively equal. And now that the distribution's older, those people are in a very different variety of situations. As a result, you would expect inequality to be higher, okay, right now. So often when you build these measures, you can see that age and the existence of life cycles leads to the distribution of income looking different, and we might think that's perfectly admissible. We might think that's fair as opposed to unfair, okay? Cool. So before our break, I just want us to start on policy, take us up to our final game. So when we talked about all this inequality stuff, we noted that there were two different types of income. There's the income that exists in the market, and then there's the income we actually have available to us, what's called disposable income. That disposable income depends on the government's decision about what to spend on and the government's decision about how to transfer funds. So when we think about what's happening, the government can decide to spend on a road, and that gives people some non-market consumption. They can go and use that road. That is a form of redistribution, okay? The government can similarly set minimum wages. And because minimum wages are different, okay, say that they're higher, okay, that will lead to the person who's employed and working the same number of hours receiving more income, okay? And that could well come from higher prices being set. It could come from the employer earning less. It could come from someone else not being employed, etc., etc. So there can be all sorts of types of trade-offs. And the minimum wage literature is a fascinating one because it's trying to tease out those differences, right? So a lot of the modern minimum wage literature shows that there isn't disemployment from higher minimum wages, but it does lead to other changes, okay? So take New Zealand. New Zealand has the highest minimum wage to average wage in the OECD by quite a way. And we've also got the highest non-tradable prices. Therefore, the minimum wage acts as a form of what we call pre-distribution. It's changing a market price, that minimum wage floor, which leads to a redistribution to the people that receive that away from some other group, okay? Now, it's not our job here to try to evaluate what's right or wrong or anything. That's just a framework for how we can think about it. Now, other things that can happen is we can actually have taxes and transfers happen. And those taxes and transfers might do something like this, where they push the Lorenz curve closer to the line of complete equality. That type of post-distribution is where we use government funds not to go and spend on something or to implement regulations, but to put in place taxes and transfers. Now, even if they didn't transfer, the act of taxing could turn around and lead to this curve doing this. Why? Because if you're taxing someone who's on a higher income proportionally more, then their share of income will decline. And so this whole curve will move up. These are proportions. So that's how it works. Okay. Now, just before we have our break, just before, I want to quickly talk about these ideas here. What is the first and second welfare theorem? Has this come up in class at all? No. Cool. Well, we're not going to do it in any great detail. It's pretty much saying that if you had perfect information and if there was no competition issues and you have a situation where people are relatively rational, then you're going to get outcomes that are efficient in some sense, right? Namely, in order to make anyone better off, you have to make someone else worse off. The second welfare theorem tells us if we change the amount people are endowed with, the amount people start with, then you end up in a different situation that's also efficient, also Pareto efficient. Now, you might prefer that. You might say, I've made some people worse off and some other people better off, but the people that are made better off were people that are very vulnerable, etc., etc. So you put the first and second welfare theorems together, and you get this idea that it's about changing those endowments. Don't fiddle around with the market pricing itself. Just change what people have available. And if people have enough available, they have the opportunities to go and do what they desire. People have different preferences, they'll reveal, yada, yada. Now, there can be competition issues, and there can be information issues. And so there should be government policies dealing with those themselves. They aren't about redistribution. Now, why might we ignore that? And why did Australia especially ignore this? And New Zealand, through until 1984, was strongly against this idea as well. Why? The reason for that is that New Zealand and Australia felt that there were certain types of targeting they wanted to do by setting higher minimum wages, by having wage boards and the such. And they were concerned about administrative costs of having a tax and transfer system, the idea of churn. You take $1 off someone and give it back to them, okay? Now, in other countries, they're not as worried about those things. And when we talk about targeting, the idea of targeting there is this concept of, hey, you are working, and therefore, since you're working, you should receive a certain minimum, as opposed to you who's not working, don't care, okay? Now, that can come off in a very bad way if you don't have a strong welfare state. The thing that people don't say about the 80s and early 90s reforms, because there was a lot of horrible stuff that did occur in them, but they thought they were being very generous to groups who they saw as vulnerable, such as disabled groups. Okay, but they just didn't consult enough with those groups to actually figure out what they were doing. The rhetoric of the time was based on we need to target need more appropriately, and we need to switch from this model that's focused on wage earners. Okay, so there's reasons within there, but a lot of the economic discussion you'll see is focused on this first and second welfare theorem concept. Now,